On a crisp autumn evening in 1919, the corridors of the White House fell eerily silent. President Woodrow Wilson, once so vibrant and determined, lay stricken by a devastating stroke. Visitors were turned away, official documents disappeared before reaching the Oval Office, and even top-tier cabinet members found themselves blocked by a surprising gatekeeper. That gatekeeper was Edith Bowling Galt Wilson, the president's second wife. She presented herself as a mere steward, but staffers like Erwin Ike Hood Hoover would later reveal that her role went far deeper than simply caring for her husband's health. In fact, over the next year and a half, Edith Wilson arguably wielded presidential power behind closed doors, ushering America through one of the greatest cover-ups in political history. But first, if you love stories of profound, historic, and timeless intrigue, you've come to the right place. That's what we do here. 2 new episodes drop each week, each delving into the hidden corners of American history and the extraordinary figures who shaped it. Be sure to like and subscribe and never miss a tale that proves truth can be stranger than fiction. Ike Hoover was the White House chief usher by the time Woodrow Wilson took office, but his connection to the executive mansion stretched much further back. In the early 1890s, when electricity was still a novelty, he was hired as a young electrician under President Benjamin Harrison's administration to install and maintain the mansion's new electric lights. Gas lanterns were still the norm in many parts of the country, so an electrician in the White House, that was cutting edge. Hoover's steady competence led to part-time then full-time employment. He served through the Cleveland, McKinley, Roosevelt, and Taft presidencies, rising through the ranks until he oversaw every aspect of the House's daily operations, staff schedules, state dinners, and even the personal comings and goings of the first family. By his own account, it was a role he cherished. He prided himself on discretion and the seamless functioning of an institution that was both a national symbol and a working home. When Woodrow Wilson arrived in 1913, Hoover was already a trusted fixture. He observed the arrival of Ellen Axon Wilson, the first Mrs. Wilson, and remembered her with warmth. By August 6, 1914, however, Ellen had passed away, leaving the White House in deep sorrow. Hoover later wrote that the place became strangely lonesome and different without her gentle presence. The president carried on with a stoic dignity that impressed the staff, though everyone felt the weight of his loss. Then barely 16 months later, Wilson shocked official Washington by courting a widow named Edith Bowling Galt. The staff remembered Mrs. Ellen Wilson fondly, but also sympathized with the president's solitude. They noted that Edith was spirited, modern, and quickly became the center of Wilson's attention. Hoover noted the day in December 1915 when the president dutifully applied for a marriage license in the regular way, paying his fee of $1 and answering the clerk's questions despite being the leader of the country. Edith Bowling Galt Wilson moved into the White House as the new First Lady, a second marriage for Wilson and a chance for him to share his life again. She had grown up in rural Virginia in a family claiming lineage to Pocahontas and had once been married to a businessman named Norman Galt. Upon his death, she ran his store and became a well-off widow about town. Edith's quick wit and strong opinions endured her to some and put off others, but there was no doubt she deeply cared for the president, especially once America was plunged into World War I in 1917. By the war's end the following year, Woodrow Wilson was riding high on the world stage, advocating for his 14 points and the League of Nations. However, that international vision caused domestic tensions, particularly in the U.S. Senate. By 1919, Wilson felt compelled to take his case for the League of Nations directly to the people in a grueling cross-country speaking tour. Edith accompanied him, as did personal physician Dr. Carrie T. Grayson, assorted aides, Secret Service men, cooks, and members of the press, all crammed into a presidential train car named the Mayflower. Hoover himself stayed behind in Washington to manage daily White House affairs. But he did hear frequent reports that Wilson was showing alarming signs of exhaustion, weight loss, severe headaches, and shortness of breath. But the president refused to cut the trip short. On September 25th, after a major speech in Pueblo, Colorado, Edith found Woodrow trembling with nausea and uncontrollable muscle twitching. Even that didn't deter him from trying to continue. Dr. Grayson's concerns grew graver by the day. By late September, the Wilsons had returned to Washington, but the worst was still to come. On October 2nd, Woodrow Wilson collapsed with a catastrophic stroke. Some accounts say he awoke feeling numb on one side. Others claim he fell in the bathroom and lost consciousness. Regardless of the specific details, Edith quietly summoned Hoover and asked him to fetch Dr. Grayson immediately, telling him only, "Please get Dr. Grayson, the president is very sick." 10 minutes later, the physician emerged from the bedroom and confessed, "My God, the president is paralyzed." Hoover's recollections paint a stark picture of those early days. The public was told only that Wilson needed rest, no mention of the severity of his condition. Yet behind closed doors, Edith Wilson asserted control with a determination few had anticipated. She insisted on screening the president's visitors, deciding who could see him and for how long. She also oversaw the flow of paperwork, placing herself at the bottleneck of executive power. Cabinet members who had once strolled confidently into the Oval Office now found themselves pleading with Hoover for an audience, only for him to relay Edith's firm refusal. "The doctor says the president cannot be disturbed," she would explain, though the line between medical advice and her own judgment often seemed very blurred. Government documents piled up on the First Lady's desk. Some were returned with Wilson's shaky signature. Others returned with her notes, no signature at all. Hoover described in his memoir how staff moved around in anxious silence, fearful of crossing a line or angering Mrs. Wilson. Once a senator came demanding 5 minutes with the president for an urgent matter. Edith told him calmly that she alone would deliver his message. The senator left in frustration, but there was little he could do. There was no radio, no television, no social media to broadcast his complaints, no 25th Amendment to clarify presidential incapacity. The Vice President Thomas Marshall famously remarked that he had no idea how sick Wilson really was, as no one would give him the full truth. Some staff whispered that Edith was forging Wilson's signature on key documents. Others insisted she guided the president's trembling hand whenever a signature was absolutely necessary. Rumors circulated that she had learned to code and decode top-secret wartime messages, granting her extraordinary access to intelligence that usually only senior officials typically saw. Overseas newspapers picked up the story of the ailing American president and his formidable wife. The London Daily Mail called Edith the acting president of the United States. The Nashville Tennessean labeled her the nation's first presidentress. Some American papers were less kind, raising questions of constitutionality. But the White House remained a tight-lipped facade, and Edith publicly downplayed her involvement. She said she was merely protecting her husband, giving him some space to heal, and ensuring the country didn't fall into chaos. Hoover, for his part, did as he was told. He made sure staff were paid, receptions were scheduled, if rarely held, and the House operated with an outward sense of calm. Yet he and others on the inside knew the truth. Edith Wilson was, for all practical purposes, running the show. As the weeks turned into months, Wilson made slow progress in regaining some speech and the ability to stand with assistance. He never fully recovered, and Edith continued to regulate access. Cabinet members either worked through her or chose to resign if they felt ethically compromised. The vice president remained sidelined. With no legal framework for handling a president who was alive but incapacitated, Hoover watched in quiet astonishment as the White House adapted around this extraordinary situation. Edith's power grew to a level that was almost impossible to conceal. Political figures began complaining more openly, but without photographs or modern media coverage of Wilson's true condition, the administration managed to keep details murky. When the talk grew too loud, the official statement insisted the president was resting on doctor's orders. That was, in a narrow sense, accurate, but it left out the reality that for more than a year, Edith Wilson effectively functioned as a gatekeeper of national policy. Ike Hoover felt conflicted. He respected the loyalty Edith showed the president, who might not have survived the stress of full-blown exposure. Yet, he privately wondered if the secrecy truly served America or merely preserved Wilson's personal ambitions, particularly regarding the League of Nations. Staffers confided in Hoover, asking if something should be done, but he believed that any open admission of Wilson's incapacitation might trigger a larger constitutional crisis. The country, still reeling from the war and on edge about global alliances, might panic. So Hoover remained discreet. By mid-1920, Wilson occasionally appeared in public, though frail and often in a wheelchair. The cabinet had resigned itself to dealing with the First Lady on major decisions. Public appearances were heavily choreographed, and the big question hung in the air: could Wilson even fulfill his second term? The answer was effectively moot by March 4, 1921, when Warren G. Harding took the oath of office. Hoover stood among the staff on the White House steps, watching the Wilsons depart. The president leaned on Edith for support, looking pale and exhausted. Edith paused before stepping into the car, turning back to give Hoover what he later described as a subtle, knowing smile. A small acknowledgement, perhaps, of the shared secret they had kept. Hoover would serve multiple subsequent presidents, but he never forgot the silent tension of the Wilson years. No official crime had been committed. Edith Wilson maintained with some justification that her actions protected both her husband's health and the stability of the nation. Critics, however, called her an unelected usurper, running foreign and domestic policy without a constitutional mandate. Modern scholars still debate whether she was America's first female president in all but name. Hoover's own writings stop short of accusing her outright, but drop enough hints to confirm that she did far more than hostess and charity work. She screened policy decisions, oversaw wartime secrets, and shaped the government's response to pressing national issues, all while the president lay recovering in an upstairs bedroom. The entire episode stands as a testament to how precarious executive power can be when the lines of secession and transparency are not clearly drawn. Historians often point to this period as evidence supporting the eventual creation of the 25th Amendment, which clarifies what should happen if a president is unable to fulfill the duties of office. In 1919, 1920, no such roadmap existed. Ike Hoover and others in the White House found themselves operating in a constitutional gray area, shielded from the public but fully aware that American governance had taken an unprecedented turn. Decades later, as Hoover reflected on his more than 40 years at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, he maintained the politeness and circumspection that characterized his service. He seldom spoke ill of those he served, yet his recollections paint a picture of a uniquely powerful First Lady, one who took charge at a critical juncture, no doubt loving her husband deeply, but also stepping beyond any First Lady's historical role. To some, she was a guardian angel. To others, she was a constitutional trespasser. Either way, she shepherded the country through a veiled crisis. Without Hoover's careful notes and general observations, large parts of this story might never have come to light. Edith Wilson herself dismissed the idea that she had seized power, calling such allegations ridiculous and insisting that her husband's mind was keen even if his body was weak. But staffers like Hoover, who were there to see the hush-hush changes in scheduling, the repeated blocking of once powerful cabinet officials, and the coded messages she learned to decipher, knew how much influence she truly wielded. Newspapers might speculate, but they lacked confirmation. Hoover and others kept their silence, believing they were preserving both the president's dignity and the nation's well-being. In the end, Woodrow Wilson left office more tragically than any president in recent memory. Physically diminished and overshadowed by the League of Nations' partial failure in Congress, Edith stood by him until his death in 1924. She lived on until 1961, always defending her role. Some historians call her the most powerful First Lady who ever lived. Others say she embodied the limitations and vulnerabilities of an era without modern checks and balances. Perhaps both are true. She was a devoted wife who believed in saving her husband from stress, but also a woman who de facto managed the American presidency from 1919 to 1921. Ike Hoover's story underscores how precarious leadership can be and how easily power can shift when no one is looking. It reminds us that the White House, despite its grandeur, is still a home, filled with personal relationships, loyalties, and well-kept secrets. In those secretive months of Wilson's incapacitation, the fate of a nation may well have hinged on one woman's determination not to let go. For better or worse, Edith Wilson carved out an extraordinary place in American history, and Ike Hoover was there to witness the transformation firsthand. Sometimes the greatest secrets in government aren't the ones explicitly labeled classified, but the quiet, day-to-day decisions made behind closed doors. Decisions that can change the course of a presidency or even an entire country.
New Heath Story episodes drop twice a week only on the Jim Heath channel. If you'd like to help keep Heath Story going, consider supporting us on Patreon.